Hi everybody, it's Jane from Jane Rowland Photography. And in my last video I was on a creative retreat in Northumberland and I wanted to have a go at some street photography. I've never done street photography before, so I had a look online at what other street photographers did, and what became really apparent was that there isn't one style of street photography. There's loads of different approaches, and it's a bit overwhelming when you first have a look at the type of street photography that might be suited to you. So what I found really helpful was to break it down into 5 subcategories, so I could look at each category in turn and decide which type of street photography would suit me and my personality. And I'm going to show you the photographs that I took at the end of this video, but I thought before I did that I would share with you the 5 categories that I came up with, because even though they're not recognised categories, they're just categories I've made up, they really helped me to decide which type of photography I was drawn to and which type of photography I knew I really didn't want to do. So the first category I called in-your-face street photography, because as the name suggests, it's when a photographer literally just steps out in front of you and sticks the camera in your face and takes your photograph without your consent. It's the most aggressive type of street photography, and there is an American photographer called Bruce Gilden who has made his reputation doing this style of photography. He also uses a flash, which is a really harsh form of lighting, and he uses a wide-angle lens. So the portraits that he takes are actually quite unflattering because the light's really harsh and unforgiving. And there's another street photographer called Dougie Wallace who has an identical style of photography, but he photographed people on the streets of London when they were coming out of Harrods department store. He photographed very wealthy people. And even though the kind of demographic he was photographing was very different to Bruce Gilden, the portraits are actually very similar because they're also not very flattering and almost caricatures in some cases of very, very wealthy people. Now, I know already that this style of photography is not for me. It's far too aggressive and far too confrontational. But I have added a third photographer to this category who I absolutely love, and that is someone called Martin Parr. He is similar in some ways because he also uses flash and his portraits aren't always very flattering. But for me, that's where the similarity ends, because there's a wit and a humour to his photographs that I personally don't see in the other 2 photographers, and he captures the essence of British culture in a really quirky way. I love how he photographs portraits of people, but he often won't include their faces. He'll take a torso, or he'll take the back of the heads or the hairstyle or something like that, and that's definitely something that I would like to emulate in my photography. So I'm really inspired by him personally, and I can see that there are elements of what he does that I would put into my own photography. So the second type of street photography I've identified is what I've called sneaky street photography. And that's when a photographer tries to take someone's photograph secretly without their knowledge, someone who's sitting quite close by. And to me, that's a little bit underhand. It's not very honest and actually a bit creepy. So that's not the kind of photography that I want to do. The third category that I have identified is what I've called socially disadvantaged street photography, because a lot of street photographers are drawn to homeless people or people who are down on their luck, and yes, they do make interesting portraits, but for me I would feel like I was taking advantage of somebody's misfortune, and it doesn't feel ethical. I'd feel like I was exploiting them. So I know that type of street photography is not something that I'm drawn to. So that leaves 2 types of street photography that I've identified, both of which really appeal to me. And the first one is what I've called fishing street photography, because the approach is like when you go fishing and you find your spot first of all, and then you wait for a catch. And it's exactly the same process. You find your location first of all, an interesting location. So it could be somewhere that's got a colourful mural or a wall, or it could be somewhere that's just got a shaft of light, and you wait until a person walks into your frame and then you take the photograph. But there are 2 photographers who are very well known in this genre, and one of which is a Chinese photographer called Fan Ho, and he is the master of using light and shade and putting elements in the frame in just the right position. This type of photography appeals to me because you don't necessarily have to ask someone's permission, because they're quite a way away from them. You're not really taking their portrait. It's more the shape of their body, which is an element in the frame. And so that composition really appeals to me. And the second photographer that's really well known for this is arguably the founding father of street photography, and that's Cartier-Bresson. And he coined the phrase the decisive moment because he argued that great photography was all about timing and pressing the shot at exactly the right moment. And this is probably his most well-known photograph, and this embodies that principle. So the last category I've identified is what I've called ethical street portraiture. And I've called it that because it's when you basically approach a stranger but you ask their permission to take their photograph. Now for me, it's ethical because it feels like the right thing to do. You're getting someone's consent, and if they don't agree to it, you just don't take their photograph. For me, that's a comfortable thing morally. I'm not saying it's a comfortable thing to do, especially if you're an introvert like I am. Actually approaching a complete stranger and asking to take their photograph is quite a daunting thing, and I never really got the opportunity to do that in my when I was away on my little retreats. So but it is something definitely that I want to do because I'm really drawn to those types of street photographs. So that is still in my to-do list, but I didn't actually manage to do it on my actual holiday. So I'm going to share with you now the photographs that I did take when I was away. Now I did say in my last video that I would share them with you, good or bad, and I know that most of these photographs, if not all of them, are really not very good. But I really do think that you have to take a lot of bad photographs to get better. And I can honestly say that almost every photograph that I took, when you actually look at it and analyse it, there are things in it that you can think, you know, that are a learning process, and you can take away and try and do something better next time. So I've just got my iPad actually, so I'm going to go through them as I'm going to bring them up on the screen just so I can see what you're looking at. So the first three photographs really are, they're not really critiques, they're just something that I noticed about myself when I started doing this. And this is that I'm drawn to people who are having solitary moments. And I don't know if that's because I myself am an introvert and I have my own solitary moments. So this man, for example, was just on a bench and he was just staring out over the harbour. And I was just drawn to him because maybe I'm nosy, but I'm just curious about what he was thinking about and that kind of thing. And there was another lady here that was sat outside her caravan reading her Kindle or whatever it was and had a cup of tea. And that is exactly the kind of thing that appeals to me. And then you've got someone else here, this is back in Harrogate actually at home, and they are just very quietly by themselves reading a book, and that kind of thing I'm drawn to. So the reason I've started with these three photographs is you might notice that you're actually drawn to something without actually realising it. And I didn't realise it till I got home and looked at these pictures, that actually there is something in someone having a quiet moment that I'm very drawn to. So what I also noticed that I did a lot was use foreground and background elements, and sometimes they worked and sometimes they didn't. I quite like this photograph, but I think I like it because of the bird, actually, because there were loads of these birds around on that in that morning, and I didn't know what they were, and I went home and looked them up, and they were starlings, and I've only ever seen them far away when they're doing their, you know, murmurations and acrobatics, and there were loads of them around. So I think I quite like this photograph because it reminds me of a very pleasant morning that I was having. And so sometimes you get emotionally attached to photographs when they might be very good, but anyway, I quite like it. But the other two photographs, I use the same technique, and they really don't work because in this photograph, for example, it was an ice cream stand, but there's no link with what's going on in the background. If they were eating an ice cream or the little girl had dropped her ice cream and was crying, there would be some kind of link between the foreground and the background, and there isn't, so it doesn't work. Same with this photograph as well. Had there been a dog doing its business on the beach, there would have been some kind of humorous juxtaposition in terms of the foreground and the background, but there isn't. So I think I like this approach when you have the foreground and the background, but there has to be some kind of link either in meaning or in colour, and there is no link with these photographs, so they don't really work. This photograph really doesn't work. However, I did take something away from this, and that is the shape, the body shape of the statue, the fisherman, and the lady crossing the road. And obviously it's really cluttered, there's loads of people around, so it doesn't work at all. But moving forwards, what I would like to look for is some kind of element of mirroring. If there was a statue, then I'd hang around and try and wait until a human passed by and actually mirrored the body language in the statue. So if she had a hand up to her face, or she had a bag swinging out behind her, there might have been some kind of echo and link between her and the statue. And there isn't in this photograph, it's a rubbish photograph, but in the future that is something that I would look out for. So it is kind of a learning curve. Now, obviously this is not my photograph, but what I think the value of street portraiture is the value that actually increases as time goes by. And this is like a lost world. You know, I can vaguely remember Rag and Bone Men myself, but in street photography, when you look at, you know, photographs from like decades ago, every, you know, element, the buildings, the cars, the clothes that people wear, they all assume much, much more importance than they do at the time, because, you know, they're just kind of ordinary, but they become more and more extraordinary as time goes by. And I was trying to think about when I was taking my pictures. Obviously, we're in the middle of history at the moment. We're living through history with the pandemic, and I wanted to try and capture a little bit of this time in the photographs that I was taking. So in this photograph, you have got obviously the social distancing sign, and this is one of those very colourful seaside shops, which is okay, but I quite like this one better because there's a hint of the pandemic, because he's got his mask around his chin, but I also like the fact that it's got a little bit of British culture as well, because we all know what 99 ice creams are. And finally, this is actually probably the only photograph that I quite like, and it was a complete fluke because I was sat down, actually I was having a break and I was reading my Kindle, and these people came and sat in front of me, and this dog turned round while the owners were looking away, and the dog turned around and just kept staring at me. So I actually quite like this photograph. Of all the photographs that I took, this is my favourite. So they're my photographs, and obviously they're not brilliant, but the process of doing that really, really helped me. And there are 3 takeaways that I got from doing that. The first one is that you have to lower your expectations. I'm moving away from studio portrait photography, and when you're doing that kind of photography, your success rate's actually really high because you've got control of everything. You've got control of the lighting, the posing, the background. You have control of nothing in street photography, and I so many times saw some brilliant kind of opportunities to take photographs, but people move, the situation changes so quickly that you miss loads of those opportunities, and that is the nature of street photography. So that was my first takeaway. The second takeaway was actually, this is one occasion where having a big fancy camera is a real disadvantage, because if you use your phone, you're far more, you blend in with the crowd, you're far more discreet, and it's not as daunting and intimidating for somebody on the other end of your camera. So the third takeaway is that the most important quality, I think, is patience. I haven't got a lot of it. I've realised, you know, I've seen people on YouTube who say they've gone back to the same spot for weeks, maybe months on end, until the right person has walked across their frame wearing the right clothes or the right colour. And I've not got that patience yet. Half an hour and I was ready to go and get some fish and chips. So that's an element of my personality I definitely need to improve, in terms of, you know, to improve my street photography. So I hope that you found that useful. I certainly found the process of breaking it down into categories really useful. So if you have got any tips that I haven't mentioned for street photography, then I'd be really happy for you to put those in the comments, and because I'm obviously still getting better myself.